You don't win a war with shiny new dreadnoughts and parade ground soldiers. You win it in the mud. When Command sent the 104th into the meat grinder of Sector 4, they denied them heavy armor. They handed them a shattered logistics bot, a piece of garbage meant for the scrap heap. They expected the squad to die quietly. They didn't realize who was holding the wrench. This is the story of a mechanic, a broken machine, and a battlefield nightmare. The mud on Acheron didn't just stick to your boots, it climbed them. It was a semi-sentient paste of clay ash and the vaporized remains of a half-dozen failed offensives. Riley Foster dragged her boots through it, carrying a busted servo motor over her right shoulder. The sharp, twisted edge of the casing dug into her collarbone, but she didn't shift the weight. The pain kept her awake. She ducked under the heavy canvas flap of the quartermaster's tent. Inside it smelled of stale coffee ozone and impending defeat. Quartermaster Miller didn't even look up from his datapad. He was a man who had made a career out of saying the word no in 70 different inflections. Today he looked particularly practiced. Requisition Form 409-B, Riley said, dropping the ruined servo onto his folding table. The metal hit the plastic with a loud crack. My squad rotates to the front-line trenches at 0400. The Zathi have been shelling Sector 4 for 3 days straight. Command promised us an automated fire support platform, an Aegis class, or at least a standard bipedal gunner. I'm here to collect. Miller sighed. He slowly reached out and pushed the greasy servo motor to the edge of his desk. Command promises a lot of things, Foster. Command promised we'd be home by harvest. Command promised the fleet had orbital superiority. He finally looked up. His eyes were bagged, red-rimmed, and utterly hollow. You're not getting an Aegis. I don't have any Aegis. The 82nd took the last 3 working armor units yesterday, and 2 of them are already slag. So what are you giving me? Riley leaned over the table, planting her grimy hands on the plastic. We're holding a corridor against a species that uses acid-spitting shock troops. We need heavy suppression. You send my boys out there with just rifles, and they are going to get chewed to pulp. I'm sending you with what I have, Miller said defensively. He tapped his datapad, bringing up an inventory list that looked tragically short. Bay 4. Take it and go. Riley didn't argue. Arguing with Miller was like trying to punch a fog bank. She turned on her heel, her heavy boots squeaking against the wet plasteel grating of the tent floor, and headed out into the perpetual drizzle. Bay 4 was a rusted corrugated metal lean-to at the edge of the forward operating base. It was where they kept the write-offs. Equipment too damaged to fight, but too heavy to ship back to orbit. Riley keyed the heavy padlock, slid the screeching door open, and stepped into the gloom. She stopped. She blinked. And then she let out a low, humorless laugh. Sitting in the center of the bay was an L9 Mule. It was a quadrupedal logistics drone designed exclusively for carrying ammunition crates across uneven terrain. It had no weapon mounts. It had no targeting software. It had a reinforced cargo bed where a gun should be, and a sensor suite designed only to follow a designated human master and avoid walking off cliffs. Worse, it was completely trashed. The front left leg was missing below the knee joint, replaced by a jagged stump of sheared carbon fiber. Its primary optical sensor, the large glass-domed eye on its sloped front plate, was shattered, spider-webbed with cracks, and leaking a slow drip of clear optic fluid. The chassis was scarred with plasma burns. It looked like a dead insect waiting to be swept away. Riley walked a slow circle around it. You've got to be kidding me. She pulled a diagnostic cable from her belt and jammed it violently into the mule's data port. Her wrist comp lit up with a cascade of red text. Systems offline. Motive control, critical failure. Power plant 40% output. Safety protocols engaged. Combat rating SNA. This wasn't a clerical error. Command knew the 104th was a ghost squad. They were plugging a gap in the line, buying time for the main force to retreat. They were handing Riley a broken pack animal, because they didn't want to waste a real war machine on dead men walking. Anger, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. It wasn't the hot rage of a fresh recruit. It was the icy, cynical fury of a veteran who realized exactly how cheap her life was. She kicked the mule's bent chassis. The drone let out a pathetic, low-frequency hum, a failsafe trying to boot a system that wasn't there. "They think we're garbage," Riley whispered to the empty bay. She looked at the shattered drone. It was discarded, expendable, sent out here to be forgotten. Riley ran a grease-stained thumb over the cracked optical sensor. "Yeah," she muttered. "Me too, buddy." She hit the manual override switch on the side of the chassis. The drone shuddered. Sparks spat from the severed leg joint. Riley grabbed the heavy tow cable coiled on the wall, hooked it to the mule's frontal drag ring, and threw the strap over her shoulder. Gritting her teeth, she leaned forward, digging her boots into the mud. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy metal carcass began to drag across the dirt. She was going to take it back to her workshop. If Command wouldn't give her a weapon, she was going to build a monster. Riley's workshop was an unauthorized modification of a troop transport container, smelling permanently of ozone-burning solder and synthetic cheap tobacco. Rain hammered a relentless, deafening rhythm against the metal roof. The broken mule took up most of the floor space. Suspended from heavy chains, its chassis was stripped bare. The protective cowlings were thrown into a corner, exposing the dense, ugly labyrinth of hydraulic lines, copper wiring, and micro-servos beneath. Sergeant O'Connor ducked into the container, shaking water from his armored helmet. He took one look at the mess and whistled. "Miller really screwed us, huh? What the hell is that?" "A toaster. It's an L9, Riley said. She didn't look up. She was lying on a creeper under the drone's belly sparks, raining down on her heavy canvas apron as she plasma-welded a solid steel block to the stump of the missing leg. An L9. Foster, that's a baggage cart. We're facing Zathi hunters out there. Those things have armor-piercing bone spurs. They're going to tear a baggage cart in half. Not if it shoots first. Riley grunted, cutting the torch. She rolled out from under the rig, pulling her goggles down around her neck. O'Connor frowned, looking at the smooth, flat top of the drone. "It doesn't have guns, Riley." "It will." Riley stood up and walked over to a tarp covered in scavenged parts. She threw the canvas back. Beneath it lay the brutal, mangled, heavy rotary cannon of a downed gunship. It was a 30mm chain-fed monstrosity, easily half the size of the drone itself. Beside it sat two cylindrical mining charges, packed with industrial incendiaries. O'Connor's eyes widened. "Foster, you can't mount a 30mm on a quadruped. The recoil will rip the chassis in half. The internal compensators aren't rated for that kind of kinetic kickback." "I know. And its processor? It's a civilian-grade navigation core. It doesn't have targeting telemetry. It doesn't know how to lead a target or account for windage." "I know," Riley repeated. She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of black grease. "I'm rewriting the core. I'm ripping out the corporate DRM, the safety governors, the target recognition, hesitation protocols. All of it." O'Connor took a step back, looking at her like she was insane. "If you rip out the safety governors, it won't distinguish between a rock, a Zathi, and us. I'm leaving the IFF tags," Riley said, her voice hard. "Identify friend/foe. It'll know our squad's transponders. Everything else without a coalition signal is marked as a hostile obstacle, period." O'Connor stared at the jagged steel peg she had welded onto the missing leg. It was crude, barbaric. "It's going to barely be able to walk. It doesn't need to march in a parade. Riley said, turning back to the heavy cannon. "It just needs to hold the trench line." For the next 12 hours, Riley didn't sleep. She fueled herself on lukewarm caffeine paste and pure, unadulterated spite. The physical labor was grueling. She had to strip the heavy suspension coils from a derelict transport truck and manually compress them into the drone's remaining 3 legs to handle the massive weight of the gunship cannon. She mounted the 30mm cannon directly to the drone's reinforced cargo bed, using crude, ugly welds. There was no rotating turret. The drone would have to turn its entire body to aim. It was inefficient, but it was solid. She rigged the ammunition feed directly through the drone's internal chassis, ripping out the reserve battery cells to make room for thousands of depleted uranium rounds. But the hardware wasn't the hardest part. It was the software. Riley plugged her console directly into the mule's exposed brain pan. The screen filled with lines of corporate code, polite algorithms designed to yield to heavy traffic to power down if engine heat exceeded 80 degrees, to gently back away from collision threats. Delete, delete, delete. She bypassed the thermal sensors. Let the engine run until it melted. She overwrote the threat avoidance matrix with a collision intercept trajectory. If something got in its way, it wouldn't back up. It would walk through it. She tied the optic feed, half-blind and static-filled from the cracked lens directly into the rotary cannon's firing mechanism. She didn't give it a soul. She didn't give it a personality. She gave it a relentless, suicidal directive to clear the area of any non-human heat signature. At 0300 hours an hour before deployment, she tightened the last bolt on the incendiary launcher she had rigged to the drone's left flank. She stepped back, her entire body, aching hands raw and bleeding from slipping wrenches. "All right," she rasped. "Boot up." She threw the heavy breaker switch on her console. The drone didn't hum gracefully to life. It screamed. The overworked power plant shrieked as it drew triple its intended voltage. Thick black exhaust coughed from the crude vents Riley had cut into the side armor. The machine jerked. Its 3 good legs, overpressurized by the new suspension, snapped rigid, lifting the heavy chassis violently into the air. The welded steel peg slammed into the floorboards, gouging a deep scar into the metal. The chassis shuddered under the immense, unbalanced weight of the rotary cannon. Its single cracked eye illuminated. It didn't glow a gentle blue. The damaged optics fractured the light, making it burn an ugly, bloodshot amber. The drone twitched, turning its heavy bulk toward Riley. The servos whined in protest, a sound like tortured metal. The barrel of the 30mm cannon leveled at her chest. Riley didn't flinch. She tapped her chest plate where her IFF transponder sat. Inside the drone's butchered processor, 100 frantic calculations collided. The machine registered a high heat obstacle. The rudimentary targeting code ordered a firing sequence, but a single line of surviving code, hard-welded to the top of the logic stack, flared friendly. "Do not engage." The cannon twitched, lowering a fraction of an inch. The drone stood there, leaking hydraulic fluid onto the floor, trembling with pent-up kinetic energy, its amber eye static and unblinking. It looked less like a machine and more like a rabid, cornered dog. O'Connor had returned to help load out. He stood in the doorway staring at the mechanical abomination. "God Almighty," he whispered. "What did you make?" Riley disconnected her console. She unspooled a heavy lead cable and hooked it to the drone's rear tow hitch. "I made a survivor," she said. "Let's get it to the mud." Sector 4 was a scar cut into the earth. The trenches were waist-deep in freezing water and liquid mud. The 104th Squad, 22 men and women, were pressed against the dirt walls, clutching their rifles, shivering. The sky above was a bruised, heavy purple lit periodically by the blinding flash of distant artillery. Riley stood in a dugout artillery bay, holding the leash. The drone stood beside her. The heavy canvas tarp covering it was soaked through. It vibrated continuously, a low, angry vibration that sent ripples through the puddles around its heavy metal feet. The radio on O'Connor's chest crackled. "Motion trackers are going crazy. 300 meters out. They're moving fast. Hold fire until they hit the razor wire." Lieutenant Hayes yelled over the sound of the rain. "Do not waste thermal clips on the dark." The tension was a physical weight. Riley checked the safety on her own rifle, but her eyes never left the tarp-covered monstrosity beside her. Then the shrieking started. It was a sound like tearing metal and dying animals echoing across the wasteland. The Zathi didn't use battle cries, they used acoustic terror. A flare popped high above the trench line, bathing no man's land in harsh magnesium white. There were hundreds of them. Biomechanical horrors moving with horrifying speed. 6-limbed things covered in iridescent black chitin, vaulting over craters. Among them were the hunters, massive hulking beasts that spat corrosive acid, capable of eating through plasteel armor in seconds. "Open fire!" Hayes screamed. The trench line erupted. Tracer rounds chewed through the rain, striking the advancing horde. But it was a handful of gravel thrown at a tidal wave. The Zathi didn't flinch. They absorbed the small arms fire, their sheer momentum, carrying them forward. A hunter stopped, reared back, and spat a glob of green luminescence. It struck the sandbags 2 yards from O'Connor. The bags instantly vaporized in a cloud of hissing, toxic steam, taking a corporal's arm with it. The man screamed, collapsing into the mud. "They're breaking the wire," someone yelled. "We can't hold them." Lieutenant Hayes looked back at Riley, his face pale underneath the grime. He didn't have to say anything. Riley reached out and grabbed the edge of the wet canvas tarp. She yanked it back, exposing the rusted, uneven, heavily armed nightmare beneath. She slapped the manual engage button on the drone's flank. "Go to work," she whispered. The L9 mule lurched forward. It didn't step with the calculated grace of military hardware. Because of the steel peg and the massive, unbalanced weight of the cannon, it moved in a violent, lopsided gallop. It lumbered up the mud ramp, out of the dugout, its servos screaming as it hauled itself onto the flat ground just behind the trench line. A Zathi hunter, breaching the razor wire, turned its eyeless head toward the new arrival. It hissed, recognizing a mechanical threat, and reared back to spit. Inside the drone, Riley's butchered code ran a singular brute force calculation. No IFF tag. Heat signature massive. Obstacle detected. Action remove. The L9 didn't brace for recoil. It didn't calculate windage. It just opened the throttle on the 30mm rotary cannon. The noise was deafening. It was a continuous mechanical roar. Brrrrt, that completely drowned out the sounds of the battle. A 3-foot tongue of orange fire erupted from the barrel. Depleted uranium rounds the size of energy drink cans slammed into the Zathi hunter at 3,000 feet per second. The alien didn't just die, it evaporated. Its heavy chitin armor shattered like glass, the kinetic impact blowing its top half completely backward in a spray of black ichor and bone fragments. But the recoil was devastating. The sheer physical pushback of the gunship cannon threw the drone violently backward. Its front legs lifted off the ground, the chassis groaning under the stress. It slammed back down into the mud, its steel peg digging a deep furrow. A normal military AI would have registered the chassis stress and ceased firing to preserve the hardware. Riley had deleted that line of code. The drone fired again. It swung its heavy body to the left, unleashing another sustained burst into the advancing swarm. The recoil physically dragged the machine backward, scraping it violently across the dirt. It looked like a rabid animal fighting on a leash. It was tearing its own internal mounts apart, with every burst the crude welds glowing cherry red under the friction. The Zathi swarm hesitated. This wasn't a standard defense pattern. This was raw, uncalculated savagery. Two smaller Zathi drones flanked the machine, leaping into the air, their scythe-like claws raised. The L9 couldn't turn fast enough to track them. Its sensors registered the incoming collision. The original corporate software would have triggered an evasive reverse maneuver. Riley's software triggered the mining charges. The drone blew its own left flank. The incendiary charge detonated with a concussive thump, sending a wall of liquid white phosphorus outward. The two leaping Zathi were caught mid-air, instantly incinerated, dropping to the mud as burning, thrashing husks. The blast wave threw the drone onto its side. It hit the mud hard, splashing filthy water everywhere. The cracked optic sensor flickered, the amber light dimming. "It's down!" O'Connor yelled over the gunfire. "No." Riley said, her voice tight, watching the telemetry on her wrist comp. "It's not." In the mud, the L9's overpressurized legs twitched. Hydraulic fluid sprayed from a ruptured line, mixing with the rain. The machine ground its steel peg into the earth. With a terrifying groan of failing metal, it dragged itself back upright. It was bent, leaking, and half-blind. It turned its fractured amber eye back toward the swarm. The barrel of the 30mm cannon began to spin again. The Zathi, for the first time in the war, did something the 104th had never seen. They broke line. The creatures scattered, retreating back into the darkness, abandoning the breach. They didn't understand the logic of a machine that destroyed itself just to kill them. The drone fired a final short burst into the retreating darkness, the recoil shoving it back another foot. Then silence fell over Sector 4, save for the patter of rain and the heavy, ragged sound of the drone's dying exhaust fan. Riley climbed out of the dugout, walking slowly through the mud toward the machine. It stood there, trembling smoke pouring from its chassis. The barrel of the cannon was glowing a dull, angry orange. She reached out, ignoring the blistering heat radiating from the armor, and rested her hand against the vibrating metal. "Good boy," she breathed. Morning broke over Acheron, not with a sunrise, but with a slow, sickly thinning of the grey gloom. The rain finally stopped, leaving a heavy freezing fog that smelled of copper, vaporized ozone, and cooked meat. Sector 4 was a graveyard. The mud in front of the 104th trench was choked with the shattered black chitin of Zathi shock troops. Riley sat on an overturned ammunition crate, a plasma torch in one hand, and a mug of lukewarm, gritty coffee in the other. She wasn't looking at the dead aliens. She was looking at the drone. It was a wreck. The sustained recoil of the 30mm rotary cannon had nearly sheared the weapon from its crude mounts. The heavy steel suspension coils she had salvaged were warped, sagging heavily to the right. The left flank, where the machine had detonated its own incendiary charge, was a scorched canvas of blistered paint and melted sensor nodes. It sat in the mud, its engine idling with a wet, rhythmic cough. "You're going to burn out its power plant," a voice said. Riley didn't turn around. Sergeant O'Connor slid down the mud embankment into her dugout, his armor smeared with drying clay. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes bruised with fatigue. "The plant is rated for 400 hours of continuous hauling," Riley replied, taking a sip of the terrible coffee. "It can handle idling. It wasn't rated to haul a gunship cannon while detonating high explosives on its own hull Foster. The thing is bleeding hydraulic fluid." O'Connor pointed a gloved finger at a dark, iridescent puddle forming beneath the drone's chassis. "Command is screaming on the radio. They want a sitrep." "Tell them we held." Lieutenant Hayes already did. He told them the 104th repelled a Class 4 swarm with 0 squad casualties. O'Connor let out a dry, hacking laugh. "You know what Command said? They asked him to repeat the transmission. They thought it was a clerical error. They wrote us off, Riley. They didn't have a medevac or a body recovery detail assigned to this sector." Riley set her coffee down. She pulled her welding goggles over her eyes and fired up the plasma torch. The bright blue flame hissed in the damp air. They gave us a broken mule and told us to die. We didn't. What's their next genius move? We're not rotating out. O'Connor's voice lost its grim humor. He looked out over the fog-choked wasteland. Since we demonstrated exceptional defensive capability, Command is shifting the front line. They want us to push. 2 clicks north. There's a Zathi mortar ridge pinning down the 82nd Division. We're supposed to flank it. Riley killed the torch. She slowly pushed the goggles up onto her forehead, staring at O'Connor. A flanking assault, with 22 people, across open mud. Hayes is trying to fight it, but Battalion is threatening him with a court-martial. We move at 1800 hours. O'Connor looked back at the ruined drone. The machine twitched its fractured amber eye, swiveling blindly toward the sound of his voice before recognizing his IFF tag and snapping back to a neutral forward stare. Can you get the Hound walking by, then? The what? The Hound. O'Connor shrugged, offering a tired, lopsided grin. Private Davis started calling it that. Said it fights like a junkyard dog. The name stuck. Riley looked at the scarred, lopsided, heavily armed metal box. Hound. It was as good a name as any. It'll walk, Riley said quietly. It's not going to be pretty. The chassis torque is completely unbalanced. I have to re-weld the primary weapon mounts, or the next time it fires, the cannon will rip straight backward through the engine block. Do what you need to do. Scavenge anything you can find. O'Connor patted the drone's cold, soot-stained armor. The machine didn't react. This ugly bastard is the only reason we're breathing. We aren't leaving it behind. When O'Connor left, Riley plugged her datapad into Hound's diagnostic port. The screen immediately flooded with critical failure warnings. The machine was screaming in digital agony, overheating, microfractures in the drive shaft, fluid pressure dropping. She didn't run a repair sequence. She couldn't. Instead, she opened the root directory and began deleting the warning protocols entirely. If temperature greater than 120 degrees Celsius, ignore. If pressure less than 40%, reroute to primary actuators. She was suffocating its ability to feel its own death. It wasn't a kindness. It was a necessity. She needed it blind to its own destruction so it could focus entirely on theirs. Then she grabbed a heavy crowbar and walked out into the sea of dead Zathi. The alien's black chitin was incredibly dense, capable of deflecting standard infantry rounds. Riley jammed the crowbar under the thickest plates of a dead hunter, brutally prying the armor off the carcass. For the next 10 hours, the trench echoed with the sound of grinding metal. Riley used heavy-duty industrial bolts and sloppy plasma welds to bolt the alien chitin directly onto Hound's chassis. She covered the exposed hydraulic lines and the vulnerable engine block with the thick, overlapping plates. By the time she was finished, Hound looked like an absolute nightmare. It was a fusion of battered human engineering and jagged alien biology. The heavy 30mm cannon dominated its back, the crude steel peg leg stamped deep into the dirt, and its single amber eye glowed from within a cowl of blackened carapace. Boot sequence, Riley muttered, throwing the manual switch. Hound shuddered. The engine choked, coughed out a plume of thick black exhaust, and caught. The machine hauled itself up on its 3 good legs and its steel stump. It swayed heavily to the right, struggling to balance the massive weight, but it stood. It was ready for the meat grinder. At 1800 hours, the 104th moved out. The mud was a sprawling, suctioning trap that threatened to pull the boots right off their feet. They marched in a loose wedge formation, shadows moving through the dense grey fog. No one spoke. The only sound was the squelch of boots and the rhythmic, tortured clank-whir of Hound dragging its massive weight through the sludge. Riley walked directly behind the drone, her eyes glued to her wrist comp. The telemetry was a mess of red spikes. Hound's internal temperature was climbing. The mud was clogging its cooling intakes, and the jury-rigged heavy suspension was grinding against its own housing. It didn't stop. Its code wouldn't allow it. Follow the transponder. Remove the obstacles. Private Davis, a kid barely out of basic training who had lost his helmet in the trench, kept glancing back at the machine. "Is it supposed to sound like that, Foster?" he whispered. Hound's engine was making a high-pitched mechanical whine, like a kettle boiling dry. "No," Riley said, stepping over a rusted piece of shrapnel. "Keep your eyes forward, Davis." They covered the first kilometer without incident. The fog was so thick they couldn't see the sky, but the ground began to slope upward. The mud turned from a liquid paste into a slick, hard-packed clay. They were approaching the ridge. Lieutenant Hayes threw up a closed fist. The squad halted, dropping to one knee. Riley tapped a command into her wrist comp, and Hound froze its heavy chassis, rocking slightly on its suspension. "Motion trackers are pinging," Hayes whispered over the localized squad channel. "Faint. They're up there, entrenched." Riley looked up the dark slope. The Zathi mortar ridge was a jagged spine of rock overlooking the valley. If they attacked it directly, they would be marching into a wall of acid and plasma fire. "Foster," Hayes's voice crackled. "Can that thing lay down, suppressing fire while we flank left?" Riley checked the drone's ammo feed. The massive drum bolted to the rear cargo bed was holding 2,000 rounds of depleted uranium. "It can," Riley said, "but it has no cover. Once it opens up, every Zathi on that ridge is going to target it." "It's a drone, Foster. It's expendable." Riley looked at the jagged, chitin-covered machine. She thought about the hours she spent rewiring its brain, making it a protector. It was expendable. That was its literal designation. But it didn't sit right in her gut. "Understood," Riley said. She walked up to the machine. She didn't pat it this time. She jacked her hardline cable into the port beneath its cracked eye. She needed to change its engagement parameters. Right now it fired at whatever stepped in front of it. To draw fire, it needed to be aggressive. It needed to be the loudest, most dangerous thing on the battlefield. She opened the targeting logic. Current directive defend. IFF signatures. New directive advance and draw hostility. Priority target, high-density heat clusters. She set the movement protocol to a slow, continuous forward march. It wouldn't seek cover. It wouldn't retreat. It would just walk up the hill and pull the trigger until it died. "I'm sorry, buddy," Riley muttered under her breath. She pulled the cable. Execute. Hound's engine roared, venting a massive cloud of grey smoke. The machine lurched forward. Its steel peg dug into the hard clay, propelling it upward. It didn't try to hide. It marched straight toward the center of the ridge, a loud, ugly, clanking target. 104th move! Hayes barked. The squad broke left, sprinting in a crouch through the fog, trying to circle the encampment. 80 meters up the slope, the fog suddenly lit up with a sickly neon green glow. The Zathi had spotted the drone. A glob of corrosive acid the size of a basketball arced through the mist, splashing down 10 feet to Hound's left. The ground hissed, throwing up plumes of toxic steam. Hound didn't flinch. It didn't alter course. Its rudimentary sensors registered the origin of the thermal bloom. Its chassis rotated heavily. The 30-millimeter gunship cannon leveled. Brought. The night ripped open. The rotary cannon spat a 3-foot column of fire, chewing through the fog. The sheer kinetic force of the heavy rounds struck the ridge-shattering rock and annihilating the Zathi mortar position in a storm of dust and alien blood. But the recoil, as always, was brutal. Hound was on a slope. The kickback from the cannon shoved the drone backward. Its good legs scrambled for purchase, metal claws tearing into the clay. It slipped, sliding backward a few feet before the crude steel peg slammed deep into the earth, anchoring it. It stopped sliding. It re-engaged the servos. It took another step forward. Brought! Another continuous burst into the rocks. The Zathi swarmed. Dozens of them poured over the top of the ridge, chittering and shrieking, charging straight down the hill toward the roaring machine. They ignored the flanking human squad entirely. Hound was too loud, too destructive to ignore. Riley watched from the flank as the nightmare unfolded. Hound was firing as fast as the drum would feed. Depleted uranium rounds turned the charging Zathi into mist. But there were too many. A hunter lunged from the fog landing squarely on Hound's back. Its scythe-like claws tore into the scavenged chitin armor Riley had bolted on. The heavy plates held for a second, then snapped. Hound couldn't reach the thing on its back. The original logistics software would have initiated a distress beacon and shut down. Riley's software simply registered an obstruction to its forward momentum. Hound didn't stop to fight the creature on its back. It just kept walking forward, firing into the swarm ahead. The hunter reared back and sank its fangs directly into the drone's exposed hydraulic lines. Black, oily fluid erupted. On her wrist comp, Riley's screen flashed entirely red. Warning: catastrophic pressure loss. Actuator failure. Power plant critical. It's going down, Davis yelled over the deafening roar of the cannon. The 104th had reached the flank of the ridge. They opened fire with their assault rifles, pouring crossfire into the Zathi swarm, distracted by the drone. But Hound was dying. The hydraulic fluid leak crippled its front right leg. The limb buckled the servos, whining in a high, tortured pitch. The heavy machine slammed face first into the mud, the rotary cannon hitting the dirt with a massive crunch. The Zathi swarmed it. 3 hunters piled onto the downed machine, their claws tearing at the engine housing acid, dripping from their maws onto the hot metal. The metal hissed and warped. "They're tearing it apart," O'Connor grunted, slamming a fresh thermal clip into his rifle. "We have to push now while they're grouped." Riley couldn't take her eyes off the telemetry. Hound's power plant was at 140 degrees. The cooling system was completely destroyed. The engine block was melting itself from the inside out. But the code was still running. Obstacle detected. Action remove. Underneath the pile of shrieking alien bodies, the drone's remaining 2 good legs and its steel peg engaged. It didn't stand up gracefully. It convulsed. The massive suspension coils pushed far beyond their breaking point, violently expanded. Hound violently bucked, throwing 2 of the massive hunters off its back. The drone was half crushed. Its front plate was melted by acid, its cracked amber eye completely blind, shorting out in a shower of blue sparks. The barrel of the 30mm cannon was bent downward, choked with mud. It couldn't fire. It couldn't see. It could barely stand. But Riley's code didn't require sight. It only required a heat signature. Hound pivoted on its steel stump, dragging its crippled front leg. It lurched toward the largest thermal mass, the Zathi hunter that had crippled it. The machine didn't use a gun. It used its mass. With a deafening groan of failing metal, Hound threw its entire 3-ton bulk forward. It didn't tackle the alien. It fell on it. The crushing weight of the drone, amplified by the heavy gunship cannon on its back, slammed the hunter into the hard clay. The sickening crunch of alien exoskeleton echoed over the gunfire. Hound ground its steel peg into the mud, pinning the creature down. The Zathi shrieked, thrashing wildly its acid, spraying blindly into the air, melting chunks of the drone's chassis. Hound didn't care. It didn't feel the acid burning through its wiring. It just increased the downward pressure its failing engine, screaming as it ground the alien into paste. The remaining Zathi froze. They were a hive-mind species, driven by calculated aggression and swarm tactics. They understood pain, and they understood death, but they could not comprehend the sheer unfeeling brutality of a broken machine that refused to stop functioning. The psychological break was instantaneous. The swarm shattered. The remaining Zathi broke off their attack, turning and fleeing back over the ridge, disappearing into the fog. They abandoned the mortar position. They abandoned the hill. Silence slammed back down on the battlefield, broken only by the hiss of melting metal and the ragged breathing of the 104th. Lieutenant Hayes stood up, slowly lowering his rifle. "Cease fire," he rasped. "Secure the ridge." The squad moved up the hill, their boots slipping in the mud and alien blood. They gathered around the smoking ruin of the L9 mule. Hound was dead. The power plant had finally seized. The chassis was a twisted, melted lump of slag half buried in the crushed remains of the Zathi hunter. The heavy 30mm cannon was ruined, the barrel warped beyond repair. Thick black smoke billowed from its exhaust ports, carrying the smell of burned wiring and cooked oil. Riley knelt beside it. The heat radiating off the metal was intense, making the air shimmer. She reached out with a gloved hand and gently touched the warped metal cowling where the amber eye used to be. There was no vibration, no hum. The machine was empty. Private Davis stepped up beside her, his rifle slung low. He looked down at the twisted wreck, his young face grim. "It's gone." "Yeah," Riley said quietly. Her voice was thick. She swallowed hard, pushing back the unexpected knot in her throat. It was just a machine, a bundle of copper and code. She knew that. But it had bought their lives with its own destruction, asking for nothing in return. O'Connor walked up, looking at the dead drone, then out over the valley below the ridge. The fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the sprawling expanse of Sector 4. They held the high ground. "Command is on the horn," Hayes said, walking over. His voice was quiet, lacking its usual sharp edge. "They want to know our status." Riley slowly stood up. She wiped a streak of grease and mud from her cheek, staring down at the ruined, beautiful monster she had built. "Tell Command we took the ridge," Riley said, her voice turning cold and hard. "Tell them the 104th is still here, and tell them to send more broken garbage. The dropship didn't arrive with fanfare. It fell from the bruised sky like a stone, its reverse thrusters screaming against the dense Acheron gravity, kicking up a hurricane of grey mud and stagnant water. Sector 4 had been quiet for 12 hours. The 104th had spent that time digging in, reinforcing the captured ridge, and staring at the scorched, half-melted carcass of the L9 drone. Command hadn't just been surprised that they were alive. They had been terrified by the telemetry data uploaded from the ridge. The ship's ramp slammed into the muck. 2 military police stepped out, followed by a man whose uniform was entirely too clean for this hemisphere. He wore the silver bars of a battalion captain. His boots touched the mud with a look of profound distaste. Riley was sitting on a crate, stripping down her rifle. She didn't stand. Neither did O'Connor. Lieutenant Hayes walked down the slope to meet the officer. "Captain Briggs, we weren't expecting battalion brass." "I wasn't expecting to be here, Lieutenant." Briggs said, his voice clipped and dry. He looked past Hayes, his eyes scanning the haggard, mud-caked survivors of the 104th. Then his gaze landed on the melted slag heap of the drone. "Is that it?" "That's Hound, sir," Private Davis said from the trench line, his voice carrying a defensive edge. Briggs walked past Hayes, ignoring the mud sucking at his polished boots. He stopped in front of the ruined machine. He pulled a datapad from his coat, reading from it, then looking back at the wreckage. R&D analyzed the combat burst transmission before the unit's core melted. Briggs said, not looking at Riley, though he was standing only a few feet away. They said the code was a catastrophic cascade of errors, a viral override. They said the machine should have bricked itself the moment it booted. It didn't, Riley said, wiping a grease-stained rag over her rifle bolt. Briggs finally turned to her. You're Foster, the mechanic. I'm a combat engineer. You butchered 2 million credits worth of corporate hardware, Foster. Riley stopped wiping the bolt. She looked up, her eyes flat and cold. I kept 22 soldiers breathing. You want to bill me? Take it out of my hazard pay. Briggs didn't yell. He didn't threaten a court-martial. Instead, he let out a slow, measured breath. The Zathi are pushing a planetary offensive. They broke through the 80 seconds line an hour ago. The 14th Armored got bogged down in the salt flats and was annihilated. We are losing Acheron. Command has initiated a full evacuation of the primary forces at the spaceport. The trench went dead silent. O'Connor stood up, his jaw tight. Evacuation. What about us? The 104th is acting as the rear guard, Briggs said. The words hung in the damp air like an executioner's axe. You are to hold the canyon pass leading to the spaceport for 48 hours. If that pass falls, the Zathi swarm, the launch pads, and 30,000 troops die on the tarmac. We have 22 people, Captain, Hayes said, his voice cracking. We don't have heavy weapons. We don't have artillery. You're ordering us to be a speed bump. I'm giving you a boneyard, Lieutenant. Briggs tapped his datapad, transferring a file to Hayes's wrist comp. 3 clicks from here is a decommissioned vehicle depot. It's where we've been dumping the slagged armor from the northern campaigns. Walkers, treaded platforms, heavy lifters, all totaled, all written off. Briggs turned his cold gaze back to Riley. He looked at the ruined hound, then back to her. Command doesn't want you to die quietly anymore, Foster. They want you to make more monsters. You have 48 hours to turn that graveyard into an army. Do whatever you did to this machine to the rest of them. Briggs turned on his heel and walked back to the dropship. Good luck, 104th. Try to die slowly. The boneyard was a rusted cathedral of dead machines. It sat at the bottom of a shallow, fog-choked valley, a sprawling testament to a lost campaign. Mountains of twisted metal loomed like jagged teeth against the bruised sky. The shattered remains of Aegis bipedal walkers, Goliath-treaded tanks, and gutted logistics rigs. It smelled of rotting vegetation, old grease, and the sharp, sour tang of leaking battery acid. Riley stood at the edge of the valley, her boots sinking an inch into the contaminated soil. The rain had started again, a slow, miserable drizzle that washed the fresh blood from her knuckles. It's all junk, O'Connor said, coming up beside her. He kicked a rusted gear the size of a manhole cover. It didn't budge. Half of these chassis don't even have power plants. The ones that do are fused to the axles. Command didn't give us a depot. They gave us a mass grave. Then we dig, Riley said. She pulled her heavy canvas welding goggles down over her eyes. Strip the armor plating off the dead tanks. Pull the heavy rotary guns and the missile pods. Find me anything with intact suspension coils or working treads. We don't need them to look pretty. We just need them to move and shoot. For the next 2 days, the 104th ceased to be an infantry squad. They became scavengers. They operated on zero sleep, their blood thick with military-grade combat stims and the terrifying knowledge of the approaching Zathi horde. There were no engineers or specialists left, just terrified men and women, following Riley's frantic, barked orders. They worked with brute force. Private Davis burned out 2 winch motors, dragging the heavy torso of an Aegis walker out of a ditch. Riley didn't let them stop. When they lacked the proper lifting equipment, they used leverage crowbars and pure, desperate muscle. Riley didn't build one machine. She built a pack. She started with the Aegis torso. Its legs had been sheared off at the knees by plasma fire. She had the squad haul it over the treaded base of a ruined industrial mining excavator. It took 6 hours of crude, ugly plasma welding to fuse the military torso to the civilian chassis. She mounted twin 50-caliber heavy machine guns to the walker's shattered shoulder joints, feeding the ammunition belts directly into the gutted cockpit. Next were the mules. She found 3 L-9 logistical drones, all suffering from critical structural failures. They were blind limping and useless for transport. Riley didn't bother trying to fix their balance or their carrying capacities. Instead, she had Davis and the others bolt thick, jagged slabs of scavenged tank armor to their front plates. She stripped the surplus flamethrowers from a ruined defensive bunker and mounted them on the drones' backs, wiring the ignition switches directly to their proximity sensors. They weren't logistical tools anymore. They were walking claymores. But her masterpiece was a heavily modified urban pacification platform. It was originally designed to dispel civilian riots, a massive, boxy, 6-wheeled vehicle built to withstand thrown rocks, not armor-piercing acid. Its turret was gone, the roof sheared completely off. Riley ordered the interior crew compartment gutted. In its place, using a straining, groaning pulley system, they lowered the raw, unshielded reactor core of a downed Pelican dropship. The moment the core locked into the chassis, the air around the vehicle grew hot. The ambient radiation made the fillings in O'Connor's teeth ache. Riley didn't care. She wired the massive power plant directly into a bank of salvaged anti-aircraft missile pods she had welded to the remaining roof struts. Using a half-empty can of industrial sealant, she painted a crude, dripping white skull on its sloped frontal glacis. "What the hell are you calling that one?" Davis asked. He was sitting in the mud, wrapping a bloody rag around a crushed thumb, staring at the 6-wheeled beast. "Cerberus!" Riley grunted, her entire body shaking as she tightened a massive lug nut with a pneumatic wrench. But the hardware was only half the battle. The steel and the guns were just muscle. The software was the brain, and the software was a nightmare. Riley sat cross-legged in the freezing mud under a canvas tarp, shielded from the rain. Her console was plugged into a thick braid of data cables, daisy-chained directly into the primary processors of the 5 machines. She had to duplicate the brute force simplicity of the original Hound, but she had to adapt it for pack tactics. A single drone could be overwhelmed. A coordinated pack could hold a canyon. She bypassed millions of lines of sophisticated polite military code. Evasive maneuvers deleted. Collateral damage calculation obliterated. Ammunition conservation protocols ripped out by the roots. She wrote a localized networking script binding the 5 processors together into a crude hive mind. They would share thermal telemetry. If one drone detected a massive heat signature, the others wouldn't wait for a human command. They would pivot and pour fire into the target until the thermal bloom disappeared. They wouldn't calculate the most efficient kill. They would utilize overwhelming, disproportionate, unthinking violence. O'Connor ducked under the tarp. The rain hammered against the canvas. He handed her a foil-wrapped ration bar. She hadn't eaten in 22 hours. Her fingers were cramping, stained black with engine grease and bleeding from the cuticles. "You're making them entirely autonomous," O'Connor observed, his voice quiet. He watched the lines of red code scrolling violently across her screen. "No remote override switch, no manual safety. If the Zarthi overrun the barricades, I won't have time to sit in the dirt and hold a joystick," Riley said. She tore the foil off the ration bar with her teeth and chewed the tasteless grey paste without looking away from the monitor. "They need to fight on their own." O'Connor crouched down beside her. He looked out into the gloom where the jagged silhouettes of the machines sat in the downpour. "Riley, if they glitch, if that IFF handshake fails for even a second, it won't, but if it does, they'll turn on us. You've stripped out every moral failsafe, every rules of engagement subroutine command programmed into them. They don't know the difference between an alien and a human anymore. They only know tags. They're just moving meat grinders. Riley finally stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the cracked keyboard. She turned to look at O'Connor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, sunken into her skull, hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. Command's moral failsafes are the reason those machines were rotting in this valley while our squad got chewed to pieces in the trench. Riley said, her voice a hoarse, raspy whisper. Command cares about mitigating liability. They care about keeping the weapons clean. Morality doesn't win a war of extermination, Sergeant. Mass times velocity wins. Overwhelming firepower wins. Spite wins. O'Connor stared at her for a long moment. Then he slowly nodded, looking back at the dark shapes in the rain. Then make them mean. Riley turned back to the screen. She highlighted the final block of behavioral governors, the code that told the machines to retreat if their chassis sustained critical damage. Delete. She hit the execution key. All across the boneyard engines choked to life. The sound wasn't the synchronized, elegant hum of a military armored division. It was a deafening, chaotic symphony of whining servos, grinding gears, and overpressurized exhaust systems. 5 mechanical abominations hauled themselves out of the wreckage. They were scarred, mismatched, and terrifying. They dragged sparking cables behind them, their crude plasma welds glowing bright cherry red in the gloom. Sensor clusters flickered in fractured, bloodshot shades of crimson and amber. The Aegis excavator ground its massive treads into the dirt, its upper torso swiveling with a violent mechanical shriek. The 3 mules paced erratically, their ruined navigation cores, making them twitch and shudder like rabid dogs on short leashes. And in the center, Cerberus roared, the unshielded reactor, casting a sickly blue luminescence over the mud. They stood in the driving rain, their weapons slowly panning across the canyon walls waiting for a target. They didn't feel fear. They didn't feel loyalty. They only felt the code. Riley unplugged her console and stood up, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. "The pack is awake," she said, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the engines. "Let's go hold the pass." The canyon pass was a narrow choke point of jagged black basalt, 300 yards wide. Behind the 104th, the ground sloped away toward the sprawling concrete plains of the spaceport. In the distance, massive colony ships were igniting their thrusters, pushing columns of blue fire into the grey sky. The 104th was dug in behind a hastily constructed barricade of blasted rock and rusted tank traps. In front of them stood the machines. Cerberus sat dead center, its engine idling with a low, bone-rattling thrum. The excavator Aegis hybrid flanked the left, its twin 50 cals loaded with armor-piercing tracers. The 3 flamethrower mules prowled the front line in a restless, erratic pacing pattern, their ruined navigation cores making them twitch and shudder. The ground began to vibrate. It wasn't a localized tremor. It was a rhythmic, rising earthquake. "Contact," Hayes said over the radio. His voice was deathly calm. The fog at the mouth of the canyon didn't just part. It was pushed. The Zathi swarm poured into the pass. There were no tactics. It was a tidal wave of biological horror. Thousands of the black chitin creatures, shrieking and snapping, climbed over each other in their desperation to reach the spaceport. Above them, towering 30 feet in the air, walked a Goliath bio-titan. It was a nightmare of armor and muscle, a multi-legged siege beast that spat massive kinetic bone projectiles from a dorsal orifice. "Hold fire," Hayes ordered. "Let the machines take the aggro." Riley watched her wrist comp. The thermal overload warning flashed instantly. The pack's rudimentary sensors registered the sheer density of the swarm. The machines didn't wait for the enemy to reach the barricade. They charged. The 3 mules surged forward into the mud. They didn't have heavy cannons, so they didn't suffer the recoil issues of the original Hound. They hit the front line of the Zathi swarm at 30 miles an hour. 100 yards out, their thermal sensors triggered. Twin jets of liquid napalm erupted from each drone. They didn't aim. They simply bathed the canyon in fire. The front ranks of the Zathi ignited shrieking as the sticky, burning gel ate through their chitin. The swarm recoiled, but the sheer momentum of the thousands behind them pushed the burning aliens forward. They swarmed the mules. Riley had learned from Hound's death. She hadn't bothered armor-plating the mules. As the Zathi piled onto the first drone, tearing at its fuel lines, the machine's internal pressure gauges spiked. The suicide protocol engaged. The mule detonated. It wasn't a concussive blast. It was a thermobaric explosion. The air in the canyon vaporized in a blinding flash of white heat. Hundreds of Zathi were instantly turned to ash. The shockwave knocked the 104th flat against the mud. Before the smoke could clear, the Aegis excavator hybrid rolled forward on its rusted treads. Its twin 50-caliber cannons opened up. The roar was continuous. It simply drove over the burning husks of the dead, chewing a bloody swathe through the center of the horde. But the Bio-Titan noticed. The massive creature shifted its bulk, rearing back. Its dorsal cannon spasmed, firing a dense, jagged spike of bone the size of a telephone pole. The projectile crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, slamming directly into the Aegis hybrid's chest cavity. The kinetic force tore the machine completely in half. The heavy torso spun backward, the guns silencing instantly as the power plant ruptured. The swarm surged forward, pouring into the gap. "Open fire!" Hayes screamed. The human squad engaged. Tracers lit up the fog. O'Connor dropped a hunter, trying to scale the tank traps, while Davis fed grenades into a launcher as fast as his hands could move. But it wasn't enough. The sheer volume of the enemy was suffocating. The Bio-Titan lumbered forward, its massive hooves crushing both Zathi and machine parts alike. It locked its eyeless gaze on the human barricade. It was preparing to spit a barrage of acid that would melt the entire trench line to glass. Riley slammed her fist against the manual override panel, wired to the barricade. Cerberus target. Priority Alpha Mass execute. The 6-wheeled beast didn't roll forward. It locked its suspension, dropping its heavy chassis directly into the mud to brace against the recoil. The unshielded reactor core hummed so loudly it vibrated the teeth in Riley's skull. The salvaged anti-aircraft missile pods angled upward. Cerberus fired. Not one at a time. The machine dumped its entire payload of 32 heavy rockets in a single continuous blinding volley. The canyon was illuminated in a strobe light of rocket exhaust. The missiles crossed the gap and slammed into the Bio-Titan. The explosions chained together in a deafening crescendo. Armor cracked. Chitin shattered. Fire and black blood rained down on the swarm below. The Titan staggered, letting out a deafening subsonic roar of agony. Half of its carapace was blown away, exposing the pulsing bioluminescent organs beneath. But it didn't fall. Enraged, the Titan leveled its dorsal cannon directly at Cerberus. It fired. The bone spike struck the 6-wheeled platform perfectly in the center of its painted skull. The heavy armor warped, but held for a microsecond before the sheer kinetic force flipped the multi-ton vehicle entirely backward. It landed on its roof with a sickening crunch of metal. Smoke poured from Cerberus's chassis. The reactor core warning klaxons began to scream. "It's breached!" O'Connor yelled. "The core is going critical! Fall back! No!" Riley screamed, watching her datapad. "Look!" Cerberus was upside down. Its wheels spun uselessly in the air. Its missile pods were empty and crushed. The warning klaxons were wailing a death knell. But the Cerberus protocol didn't know how to die quietly. Obstacle detected. Action remove. The machine couldn't drive. It couldn't shoot. But the raw reactor core was still tethered to the drive shaft. Riley watched in horror and awe as the machine overpressurized its own crippled engine. The internal gyros spinning at 3 times their maximum tolerance violently locked. The sheer torque physically snapped the chassis back upright. Cerberus slammed down onto its ruined wheels, smoke and blue radiation leaking from its cracked armor. It didn't retreat. It engaged its treads. With its reactor going critical, burning from the inside out, Cerberus charged. It drove straight into the swarm, crushing Zathi beneath its heavy tires, moving with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. It rammed directly into the Bio-Titan's forward legs. The Titan shrieked, trying to step on the burning machine. Inside Cerberus, the heat tolerance reached 0. Riley's butchered code hit the end of its logic loop. System failure. Have a nice day. The unshielded dropship reactor core detonated. It wasn't a fiery explosion. It was a blinding sphere of blue plasma that expanded in perfect silence for a fraction of a second before the sound hit. The shockwave shattered the basalt cliffs. The Bio-Titan was caught dead center in the blast radius. Its legs evaporated. Its massive bulk collapsed into the expanding plasmasphere and was simply erased from existence. The shockwave hit the barricade, throwing Riley O'Connor and the rest of the squad backward into the mud. The sky burned purple and blue. Then there was only the sound of falling ash. Riley groaned, pushing herself up from the muck. Her ears were ringing continuously. She looked over the barricade. The canyon was a crater. The Zathi swarm was gone, turned to carbon shadows, burned into the glassed earth. The Titan was a smouldering smear of ash. Scattered across the blackened landscape were the melted, unrecognizable lumps of the machines. The mules, the Aegis hybrid, Cerberus. They were all gone. Behind them, a massive, thunderous roar shook the earth. Riley turned to look at the spaceport. The massive colony ships were lifting off. Columns of fire pushed them through the cloud cover, breaking atmosphere. 30,000 human lives ascending into the dark, saved by 22 exhausted soldiers and a pack of junkyard dogs. Lieutenant Hayes stood up slowly, leaning heavily on his rifle. He looked at the devastation. He didn't call battalion for a sit rep. There was no one left to call. "We hold the pass," Hayes whispered, though there was no one left to fight. O'Connor walked up beside Riley. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, his armor scorched. He looked down into the smoldering crater. "They were just machines," O'Connor said, quietly, almost as if trying to convince himself. Riley looked at a piece of twisted, glowing metal. She remembered the broken L9 mule in the quartermaster's tent. She remembered the blind, unyielding loyalty of a machine that had been designed to carry boxes, but had chosen to carry the weight of their survival instead. "They were the 104th, Riley said, her voice hard, echoing in the empty canyon. "And they fought like hell. If you felt the rumble of Hound's cannon, or the pure, unyielding grit of Cerberus holding the line, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Command might view humanity and our creations as expendable. But stories like this prove why the HFY spirit is unbreakable. Drop a comment down below if you were Riley. What kind of mechanized monster would you build from the boneyard? Share this video with a friend who loves brutal, grounded sci-fi, and make sure the bell is rung. We'll see you on the next battlefield.